I'll just introduce you Rachel Rogers, who's our Labour candidate, Oliver Ledwin, who's our Conservative candidate, and Ros Kays, who's the candidate for the Lib Dems, David Glossett, who is the candidate for UKIP, and Peter Barton, who is our candidate for the Green Party. Welcome. Let me begin by saying that this evening has really been organised by an alliance of the Dorset environmental and wildlife groups, and I just want to say a particular thank you to Sue Chamberlain, who sadly can't be with us this evening after putting in so much work to make the thing happen. Unfortunately, is ill this evening, we wish her well, and Leslie Doxey, who are the people who've really put this together, made all the arrangements, got the questions in, selected the questions and so on. So a big thank you to them for all they've done. Let me just explain how this is going to work. 8 questions have been selected, and the questioners are down here. They'll ask their questions in turn. I'll introduce them and the organisation they represent. Each candidate will then have 1 minute each to give a response. We'll take it in turns as to who goes first. And then I will return to the questioner for a short response, a short reply. And then we will take 2 responses from the audience, 2 comments, 2 remarks from the audience on that particular question. There isn't the time then for a dialogue to go on. We'll go immediately to the next question and we'll follow on from there. At the very end of the evening, once we've had all of our 8 questions, then each candidate will be given 1 minute to sum up. So while you're making comments and so on, they'll be able to keep a record, and when it comes to summing up, they'll have a chance to respond. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first questioner, and the first question is on climate change, and it's Henry Lovegrove from Friends of the Earth. Henry, who just shows where you are, and there's a microphone, I think, if you need it.
Scientists are clear that 80% of known fossil fuel reserves need to remain in the ground if we're to have a realistic chance of keeping global average temperature rises within 2 degrees centigrade, which is the internationally recognised threshold for dangerous climate change impacts. Isn't there a contradiction in pledging to limit global warming while firstly extending the life of coal-fired power stations, and secondly, seeking to maximise Dorset's and our nation's gas and oil extraction?
Okay, thank you very much, Henry.
The aim of the Labour Party is trying to put climate change at the centre of its foreign policy. We've got a massive contradiction here between trying to reduce global warming and also trying to extend the use of fossil fuels, and particularly, I suppose, you're talking about fracking. I think fracking is probably one of the least environmental ways of producing energy, but apparently we're going to get another question on that later, so you don't want me to talk about that now. The Labour Party said that it's going to push for an ambitious agreement on climate change at the UNFCCC conference in Paris in December, and make the case for ambitious emissions targets for all countries, strengthened every 5 years on the basis of that scientific assessment towards the progress of the 2°C goal that you mentioned earlier on, and pushing for a goal of net zero global emissions in the second half of this century, which that's fine. Now I know what a minute is.
In a word, no. Partly because your premise is wrong. The level of emissions does not depend on the level of exploitation of natural resources, it depends on the level of emissions. And if we successfully invest in carbon capture and storage, we can use natural resources and not emit. We have a very considerable need, this is where I agree with what's implicit in your question, to switch from coal over to much more friendly forms such as renewables and nuclear and gas in the short to medium term, but in the long run the answer has to be carbon capture and storage so that we have a balanced energy portfolio and zero emissions.
Thank you, Oliver. Over to Ross.
Okay, well, I, like Rachel, do not think that fracking is a good idea, and it certainly would be very destructive to the environment in West Dorset, but I'm going to speak about that later. I actually think that the sort of energy crisis and the shortfall that there's likely to be in the future in energy production requires a really, really intensive piece of work, and government, I think, has hitherto failed to do that. We've moved it somewhat along the way. We have increased renewable energy production. Renewable energy generation has more than doubled since 2010. It's now over 17.5% of our electricity. However, we need much more research and development in low carbon technologies, and that's what my party is interested in: tidal, energy storage, ultra low emission vehicles as well. And we want to make saving energy a top infrastructure priority. There's a whole range of ways in which we can do that. Some of that is actually limiting the amount we use, increasing our insulation in houses, limiting the amount that is used in industry. Carbon capture, I think, is part of that process, but it should not be the top priority.
Thank you very much, Ross. David.
Well, for every pro-climate paper that comes out, there seems to be one with equal opposite intentions. That is as much a fact as the United Nations IPCC was misleading. The only beneficiaries of current policies are governments who have introduced a green tax, which added some £600 to every house's heating bill. It has not reduced CO2 emissions. And there are two sorts of CO2 emission. They both produce, obviously, what is bad for the earth. But one is man-made, but far more important to this argument are natural occurrences of CO2. We've got volcanoes, we've got forest fires in America and Australia.
Okay, thanks very much, David. And over to Peter. Can I just say to you, we are using school rules here. There's to be no calling out from the audience. And we have got youngsters in here. With a minute to go, we just need to, what I said at the beginning is listen. So I don't want any calling out from the audience while our visitors are speaking. Thanks.
Yes, there is a huge, giant contradiction between the scientific evidence and what we are doing here as a country to move towards renewable. We are the 25th out of 27 European countries in development of renewable energy. We lie miles behind countries like Spain and Germany. The Green Party, therefore, would actually set more ambitious targets. We would set the target of reducing emissions to 90% by 2035 at the latest, and by 2050 we would want to achieve a zero carbon Britain. And to do that we need a massive programme of energy conservation and efficiency, including a subsidised programme of home insulation whereby we would get rid of fuel poverty, and a huge investment in renewables, creating hundreds of thousands of new, good, high-skilled jobs.
Peter and Henry, who asked the question. Can we just have a short response from you, Henry? Thank you.
Very pleasing that three of the speakers were very encouraging on this subject. Very poor that two of the speakers are urging complacency, effectively legitimising denial, which will actually affect children and grandchildren in future generations.
Thank you, Henry. There are two brief comments from the audience. I'm happy to take them. There's a gentleman there.
Yes, the world's major polluters, China, India, United States, Russia and Brazil, are not implementing any meaningful anti-pollution agreement. We need to look forward to the fact that we will live under significantly higher temperatures globally. And we therefore need to invest in infrastructures that will enable us to cope with those higher temperatures and enable people everywhere even to survive. The game has moved on significantly. And while I am not talking about Armageddon, I would say that we on this tiny, rather self-important little island cannot close off our airspace to what is happening to us from other nations around the world. This is a political problem, and it needs to be solved internationally before we can get anywhere at all.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Lapwin's point was suggesting that the crux of the matter is falling emissions. People might be surprised to know that there was a 20% increase between 2010 and 2014 of CO2 emissions from coal burnt in coal-fired power stations in the UK. Ironically, that wasn't even coal that was mined in Britain providing British jobs, but it was cheap coal from abroad, 50% of it from Russia.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. The next question is on wildlife crime from Tessa Harding from the Dorset Badger and Bovine Welfare Group. Welcome to Tessa.
Thank you. 10 years ago, hunting foxes with dogs became illegal. Yet this practice has carried on regardless since, and it is very rare for anyone to be prosecuted for breaking the law. What will your party do to ensure that the law is upheld in wildlife crimes such as this, as well as hare coursing, badger baiting, raptor poisoning, etc., etc., ensuring they are effectively tackled, the police are properly resourced to act, and perpetrators are brought to justice?
Well, every crime, regardless of whether you happen to believe that the law that creates it as a crime is right or wrong, should be prosecuted where there is evidence of it being committed. And that's one of the reasons why the Home Secretary for the last few years, and indeed her predecessors, have asked the police to continue to prosecute where there is evidence of malfeasance. And that doesn't matter with wildlife crime or any other crime. But if you're asking what my party would do to solve the particular problem that you're mentioning, we will hold a free vote in the House of Commons, and I personally, as I think is well known to most of the audience, would vote in favour of repeal of the Hunting Act, which would make it not a crime, and therefore you wouldn't have to prosecute. One of the problems about the Hunting Act is that you're ending up by prosecuting perfectly decent people who believe that what they're doing is right. That is the case, and that is very difficult to enforce.
Thank you.
It's going to be quite short, really, because my party is against the hunting of wild animals for blood sport, and we think that that should be properly policed. And you know, we would want to make sure that if it isn't being policed, that resources are put in place and work with police forces to make sure that it is. It's as simple as that. The law is the law. You know, there was a free vote in Parliament in favour of the hunting ban, and it needs to be properly policed and properly resourced.
Thank you, Ross.
More horrific than the news about hunting, and as has been said, there's been no really successful prosecution in the past 10 years, is the fact that hare coursing, badger baiting, and indeed dog fighting are actually on the increase in rural affairs. Humans hiding behind their anonymity are taking advantage of a lack of effective rural policing. And if you had effective rural policing, then maybe every other aspect of rural community life, including hunting with hounds and stealing from farms and everything, if there was more effective rural policing, then just maybe we could cut out a lot of the wrongdoings that are perceived to be going on in the countryside.
Thank you, David.
Green Party is totally opposed to all forms of blood sports, and therefore we would want to strengthen the ban on hunting and introduce tougher penalties for infringements. We would work closely with the police Yes, rural policing does need strengthening for a whole range of reasons, including the need for more vigilance for infringement on things that are jeopardising animal welfare.
I know that many farmers still value hunting as a form of pest control, but the legislation that was passed by the last Labour government was incredibly popular, not just in the cities, but also in the countryside. And I think it's shameful that a handful of people continue to flout the law and put unnecessary pressure on our police, whose numbers are currently being slashed. Frankly, we need to make sure that we're resourcing our police effectively, particularly in rural areas, and stop tolerating people who seem to think that because they don't like something, they can just ignore it.
Thank you very much. I think your answers have all been very clear for each of your parties, and I'm disappointed that Mr. Letwin's party are thinking of repealing the Hunting Act 2004, but I knew that already. But apart from that, thank you very much for your answers.
Lovely, thank you, Tessa. And I'll take two from the audience. Can we have one right over on the far side, the gentleman in the white jacket?
Strengthen the Act, for a start. I expect that from the Labour Party. There is no place in this modern society for killing a wild animal for fun. Thank you.
Thank you. None from this side. Just the gentleman who's there, just in the blue shirt. Just here, thank you.
Do you think that breaking the law regarding fox hunting as a result of the fact that the Act's entirely unenforceable, do you think it's a waste of police time, by upholding such a pointless act?
Thank you. Okay, and the third question is on fracking, which will be asked by Judy Edwards from Greenpeace. Where's Judy? Judy, welcome.
This question was also contributed to by Pam Massey. Petroleum exploration licences have been issued for parts of this constituency. Given the West Dorset Partnership fracking position statement made in December 2014, can you make it absolutely clear what your stance would be if a planning application including hydraulic fracturing were to be made here?
And I will just repeat that in case I'm just aware that the microphone's made over. So petroleum exploration licences have been issued for parts of this constituency. Given the West Dorset Partnership fracking position statement made in December 2014, can you make it absolutely clear what your stance would be if a planning application, including hydraulic fracturing, were to be made here? And we'll start with you, Roz.
Yes, I'm completely opposed to fracking. I supported the County Council motion against it last year, and report to Town Council, where I'm Town Councillor. I seconded the motion that we passed recently against fracking. Egdon Resources, who have the licence, do say that they're going to use it for oil rather than for shale gas exploration. But when you think about the countryside around Hardy's Monument, Martinstown, bits on the edge of Chickerell, even under Fordington, that's where that licence goes. It is entirely inappropriate for West Dorset. It produces huge pollution of water supplies, especially with high levels of arsenic and selenium. It would lead to appalling road traffic on our roads. I do have a petition on my website against it. If you haven't signed it, I'd like you to please. Thank you.
Thank you, Roz.
I may be at odds with my party on this issue, but I believe there are too many examples around the world of where fracking has definitely been the cause of restructuring of the substrata. And that is in large open areas where there's little population. Here in Dorset, it would be disaster if we started getting earthquakes as a result of fracking at the magnitude of even 4. Richter scale. Thank you very much, Richard. So I would be against it taking place in southern England simply because we are far too crowded.
Thank you, David.
You won't be surprised to hear that the Green Party would oppose fracking. In fact, the Green Party is the only party with an unequivocal opposition to fracking in its manifesto. I repeat, the only party. Fracking is completely incompatible with meeting our climate change obligations. There's 5 times more potential fossil fuel in the ground than we can safely use. We must leave it there. Stranded assets, they call it in the City of London. And we must make the massive transition to renewables and energy efficiency. Fracking also puts communities, livelihoods, and water quality at risk. There is no 100% safe way of preventing leakage of toxic chemicals used in the fracking process from reaching our aquifers. And also, fracking sites would entail mass lorry movements blighting our countryside. Those who oppose onshore wind use deliberately emotive language describing turbines as industrial. Well, allowing fracking really would bring a genuinely industrial landscape.
Thank you.
Well, surprisingly enough, I too am completely opposed to fracking. I'd agree, I think it's possibly the least environmentally way of producing energy. I'd agree largely with everything that Ros and Peter have already said. At the end of the day, we're talking about producing oil or shale gas, fossil fuels, finite, non-sustainable, and their use contributes to global warming. I don't even know why we're thinking about it, really. There's all the issues to do with water, contamination, competition, the water table. What are we going to do with all the excess water at the end? How are we going to dispose of it? We're going to start chucking it in the river, the sea. There seems to be no good way of decontaminating it. And my major objection is that focusing on fracking diverts our attention and our investment away from sustainable energy solutions such as solar and wind, water and biomass. And those are the things that we need to be focusing rather than on the short-term, highly polluting fracking that we're talking about now.
Now you know what it is to be Daniel in the Lion's Den. There are 2 separate questions here. One question is about fracking, the other question is about planning. So far as fracking is concerned, in line with the Energy Secretary, that's a Liberal in the coalition government, and indeed with the Labour Party manifesto, I happen to be in favour of fracking. I think it's good that we should produce our own gas supplies and our own oil supplies and not be dependent on the Middle East and the Maghreb and Russia for those things. So far as the planning application is concerned, my view would be exactly what it is in relation to other planning applications. It would depend on where it is and how suitable to the landscape it is. The actual surface apparatus required for fracking is pretty small, but in an inappropriate place it's inappropriate. In an appropriate place it's appropriate.
Thank you, Oliver.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that. At least 4 out of 5 are in opposition to fracking. And I would just say that, particularly in Dorset, we rely on, for 50% of our drinking water comes from the underground aquifers, and we cannot risk that, surely.
Thank you, Julie. And gentlemen, just here at the front.
In the recent past, we have had significant water shortages, and I don't hear this being lauded. We hear about vehicle movements, the despoiling of the countryside. We don't have sufficient water resources in this country to pump it under significant pressure underground. My personal choice is I'd rather drink the stuff.
That's from Pete Osborne of Compassionate Dorset. Welcome, Pete.
Evening. It's Pete Osmond.
Apologies.
I'm a livestock farmer, and I'm very concerned with what goes on in our country's slaughterhouses. And I want to ask you what you can do to improve the standard of welfare that our animals are subjected to. In particular, I'm thinking about surveillance, because I really don't know what goes on there. I'd like to know. And transparency. And also, certain communities have an exemption from pre-stunning animals before their final slaughter. To me, that's a very untidy thing, so can you do something about that, please?
Lovely. Thank you, Pete. Again, as a livestock farmer, I'd like to ask the candidates what improvements they would make to current standards of welfare experienced by animals on entering a slaughterhouse. In particular, I'm uncomfortable with the lack of transparency and surveillance as to what actually takes place, and also the exemption given to certain communities from pre-stunning animals before slaughter. And I think you're first, David.
There can only be one law in this country, and that requires animals to be stunned before slaughter. This law must be enforced, and at the least we must have the opportunity of knowing just how the animal was slaughtered, and that must be declared on all labelled products. We would want to see CCTVs established at all abattoirs. And finally, UKIP will ban the export of live animals for slaughter.
Thank you, David.
It's one area where the Green Party is supposed to use this. We're the only ones. We too would want the introduction, mandatory introduction of CCTV in all slaughterhouses. Undercover footage, sadly, has already revealed significant animal suffering in different slaughterhouses. We also want smaller local abattoirs to add to the facilities available. As far as the pre-stunning and stunning is concerned, we haven't got a party position on that at the moment, I must confess. But I do know that in some of the halal and kosher communities, they are already using stunning. I mean, the key issue is to monitor and identify whether there is suffering. If there is suffering, whatever the practice, it has to stop.
Thank you.
Well, the slaughter and killing of animals is already monitored by an EU directive, and slaughtermen are required to comply. I can tell you which one it is actually. It's 93/119EC. Slaughtermen have to comply with that. If we're concerned that slaughtermen aren't complying with that, they're supervised by the official veterinarians from the Food Standards Agency and from the Animal Health and Veterinary Laboratories Agency, depending on where the slaughter is taking place. Both of those have procedures in which they can follow up reports and claims of poor welfare practices, and they will investigate and prosecute people who they find not following welfare regulations. If there are concerns that those things aren't happening, the first thing to do is to contact the people who are supposed to be monitoring the welfare of them. If we're worried that those practices aren't working properly, then they can be reinforced. I personally wouldn't think my concern really would be for places where we're slaughtering animals outside slaughterhouses and not inside them, because there I think you need to have far more concerns.
Thank you, Rachel.
Well, I basically agree with what Rachel said. The slaughterhouses of the UK are very tightly regulated, very tightly regulated. I don't know how many people in this room have spent time in slaughterhouses. I have to tell you, it's not a particularly pleasant experience, but that's because it's not particularly pleasant to kill animals. If we don't want to kill animals, then we all have to be vegetarians. There are no doubt some vegetarians in this room accordingly. But at the moment, most of our population isn't, so we're killing animals. We have to do that under tight regulation. It is done under tight regulation. When it comes to the question of stunning and so on, you have an incredibly difficult balancing act, because I suspect most of us in this room, certainly I feel rather queasy about the practices that you're describing, but there are people who have very, very strong religious convictions about this.
And Ross.
I largely have to say that I agree with Rachel on this. The Liberal Democrats would require the Animal Protection Commission to investigate all aspects of slaughter, including, in particular, incentives for fast throughputs and whether sufficient electrical currents are being used, and whether different species should be stunned by different methods, because we haven't actually talked about the different methods that are used to stun poultry, pigs and cattle in particular. We also believe in smaller, more community-based abattoirs. We're very uncomfortable with the idea of transit of live animals to slaughter, although we don't want to ban it. We actually think that smaller, more localised abattoirs would mean that the distance that needs to be travelled would be much reduced, and that's the answer.
Thank you, Ros. And Pete, would you like to reply?
I guess there wasn't really enough time to get to some of that subject, but I like what the Green guy was saying. You nailed that pretty well. And say, well, no one really kind of got onto the halal kosher thing, which, like I say, I'd like to have tidied up, because it seems to be, for the benefit of the animals, it'd be great. For the benefit of everyone, consumers, and people like myself, it'd be great to have that dealt with. And also, it's like ammunition to the far right to be anti-Semitic and Islamophobic. So, you know, please sort that one out.
Lovely, thank you, Pete. We'll take two if there are ones. Anybody who would like... sorry, the chap just at the back.
The ambivalence of this question regarding slaughtering animals refers back to climate change.
Do you need the microphone?
Sorry.
Okay.
I've got the right end there. That's a relief. The ambivalence of this question, I'd like to point out that we don't have a sustainable world living as we do, eating the amount of meat that we eat. So this comes back to climate change. It comes back to having a view about vegetarianism and getting, some more reality into our politics and into the way we lead our lives.
Thank you very much.
I suggest it should be part of the school curriculum that every child should attend a slaughterhouse to know the system to which they're subscribing if they eat meat, and I am a carnivore.
The fifth question is on the environment, and Leslie Doxey. Welcome, Leslie.
Successive governments have allowed development to take precedence over environmental protections, such as sites of special scientific interest, increasing the degradation of our natural environment, with 60% of species now in decline. A healthy natural environment benefits our well-being and has its own economic value, particularly in Dorset, in tourism. What will your party do to ensure that environmental regulations are not weakened, but are upheld and enforced?
Thank you, Leslie. Again, just remember that successive governments have allowed development to take precedence over environmental protections, such as sites of special scientific interest, increasing the degradation of our natural environment, with 60% of species in decline. A healthy natural environment benefits our well-being and has its own economic value, particularly in tourism. What will your party do to ensure that environmental regulations are not weakened, but are upheld and enforced? Peter.
Well, that preservation of biodiversity, Leslie, is very high up on the Green Party's list of priorities. We would firstly repeal the National Planning Policy Framework and its presumption in favour of development. We'd put planning back into the hands of local people and local authorities, but we would need to introduce a new framework. We want a new, what we call a Nature and Wellbeing Act for the protection of wildlife and landscape. We would then require local authorities to map and protect ecological networks in their area, including existing SSSIs, and work collaboratively with other local authorities and central government to develop national spatial plans. We'd increase the amount of land offered long-term protection using the EU Birds and Habitats directives, ensuring that these directives are properly enforced.
Thank you, Peter.
Much of the regulation is already in place, but as Peter has already said, one of the problems is the presumption in favour of development. But I find this quite a difficult area to talk about because triple SIs and other kinds of designation are there for a purpose. Clearly they're there because they designate sites of special importance. But we're also talking to young people about the need for affordable housing. We're also talking about the need to develop forms of renewable energy. And there's a very difficult balance here, because if we're going to start saying that everywhere that has some kind of importance can't ever be developed for any purpose whatsoever, we're going to also be restricting the rights of our young people to live in homes and other people to live in homes. We're going to be restricting our ability to develop our own energy, and we're also going to be making rods for our own back in some ways. So I think it's a very delicate balancing thing here, which actually politics is about delicate balances, and we need to look at every single case on its own merits, on its own authorities, and make sure that people are making planning decisions.
Thank you.
Well done.
Well, the first point is that the National Planning Policy Framework presumption in favour of development does not override status such as SSI. It very specifically exempts that. Second point is that SSI protections do need to be maintained, and I suspect in a live case of Ramsham we're going to see whichever Secretary of State it is that emerges overruling the decision made by the District Council on the grounds that it is a SSI, and that's as it should be. Coming to the wider question, the National Ecosystem Assessment does show degradation, and that's why we established the Natural Capital Committee and why the Conservative Manifesto commits to maintaining that throughout the next Parliament and to a 25-year strategy for encouraging eco-diversity and biodiversity.
Thank you all.
Well, the Liberal Democrats will pass 5 green laws. A Green Homes Act, a Zero Waste Britain Act, a Zero Carbon Act, a Green Transport Act, and a Nature Bill. And the Nature Bill will place the Natural Capital Committee on a statutory footing. It will require government to set out a 25-year plan for recovering nature with annual updates to Parliament, including how to reverse the decline of UK species and their habitats and ensure that bees and other insects are able to fulfil their important role as crop pollinators. There will also be an introduction of a new public sector sustainability duty, which will require higher green criteria in public procurement policy, with particular requirements and duties for public authorities to act in a sustainable manner. We will implement the findings of the Independent Panel on Forestry, and we will institute a sustainable water abstraction regime for the public, industry and the natural environment.
Thank you, Ross.
Of course, all SSIs must continue to be protected, and that means that government must protect that legislation. But we have the interesting fact that you've got central government in the form of Mr. Pickles, who's overridden the local authority, the district council, on the concerns of Ramsham Down. The local council, supposedly our local representatives, have said yes, they're prepared to have the business of the solar farm up there. And Mr. Pickles has actually come down to me on the common sense view, which is no, the SSI must remain in being. I'm not sure, however, that the whole of Ramsham Down has the particular nature that requires that SSI specification. However, I do believe that the SSIs must be protected and against the issues and the wishes of big corporations.
Thank you, David. Leslie, would you like to reply?
Well, thank you very much for your answers. The reason I ask this question is because so often I do feel that the one place, one being actually, that doesn't have a voice is the environment. We speak for it, you speak for it, but the environment itself can't. And just to put things into the picture, the amount of damage that humanity has done to this small island, I read with great surprise the other day that Great Britain is the most deforested place in the whole of Europe. That should make you think. We need to protect these places, ancient woods and all. You can't replant an ancient wood somewhere. We've got to really think about where we're living. It's precious.
Thank you, Leslie. And there's lady, or just at the back there, isn't it? Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, I've got it the right way up, I hope. We all know that there's pressure on housing, that there's need for more building, and especially affordable housing, as you mentioned. But we must draw the distinction between greenfield sites with endangered species, and not just SSSIs, also conservation areas, and areas where people get together and you've got community voice where they just do not want something. And it's not NIMBYism. Sometimes it's preserving villages, village identities, and just protecting the environment in their local area. So I think that's very important. And yes, the brownfield sites are the ones which should be prioritised.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yes.
I'd just like to go back to the idea of protecting the environment, so a little bit separately from the planning issue. It's all very well to have triple SIs, and you can put a fence around them and say there they are and they're protected. But there are other things that threaten all of those kind of things, and one of the things that nobody's commented on is licences for genetically modified crops, which I think could probably damage a lot of the biodiversity that we've been talking about.
Thank you. Next question is on marine conservation, and it's Simon Cripps from the Dorset Wildlife Trust. Simon.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. This question was also asked by Anthony Page. It follows on quite nicely from the last question, but it's at sea, which is often forgotten, I'm afraid. I'm an oceanographer by profession. I've had the good fortune to wander around the world looking at different marine protected areas, and around the world you see that marine protected areas are fantastic at, from Canada through to Kenya. You see that they're fantastic at restoring degraded habitats, regenerating commercial fishing, and of course protecting wildlife. They do all that together. It's not fishing or protection, it actually restores commercial fishing industry around the world. Would your party, if you got into government, support the completion of a process to designate a national network of marine conservation zones, the 127 that is proposed, because currently we have only 28, with a potential of another 21 to come.
Thank you very much, Simon. So the key question, would your party support the completion of the process to designate a national network of 127 marine conservation zones? And I think we're back around again to Rachel.
Well, unfortunately, my party doesn't appear to have a policy on this issue, but certainly I would. I think the marine habitats and wildlife that live on and around our coast are a key part of our natural heritage, and certainly they're a key attraction for people who come to Dorset to visit and to study and to learn about what goes on here. And we haven't really offered our marine environments the level of protection that we've given to environments on land, and they're very vulnerable to significant pressures and threats, overfishing and pollution and waste. And as you said, the government 2 years ago promised to designate these 127 marine conservation zones, and only, so far we're only about a quarter of the way there. And I was really sad to see that the Studland Bay was left out of the second wave of proposed sites, because clearly there's some really important things that happen there.
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
Short answer is yes. That's why my party's manifesto contains a commitment of exactly that kind to what we call a blue belt. We have to do it in successive ways. We have to get to the end of it and get the whole set of marine protected areas. I think, incidentally, that what's been done in Lyme Bay is a model for much of the rest of the country. But we have to go way beyond that. I've spent a lot of time as a minister in the past few months getting to the point where we made a decision to move forward with the world's largest marine protected area around the Pitcairn Islands. And I intend, and my party intends, it's now in our manifesto, that we should extend that to the other British overseas territories. There's a huge amount of conservation of fish stocks which we can engage in, and also biodiversity by doing that.
Thank you, Oliver.
Well, We've also committed to establishing new marine and coastal reserves in our party manifesto. The Liberal Democrats do want to see all 127 original sites becoming marine protected zones. I'm particularly keen on seeing the bid for for the Lyme Bay area, which has been submitted to the European Commission to become a full marine sort of national park with proper protection of its reef habitats. We also actually, linking into what Oliver said, are particularly keen to establish, to push internationally for the establishment of a 1 million square kilometre Southern Atlantic Ocean Reserve, because we desperately, desperately need to protect Antarctica.
Thank you, David.
I'm completely behind the increase in numbers of these zones. But we have to be careful. Most of the panel attended a meeting in Lyme Regis organised by Greenpeace and the under 10 metre fishermen. These people are in relatively small coastal, very coastal fishing boats. We have to make sure that we're not driving them so far out beyond the immediate coast in places like Lyme Bay that it is totally impractical to fish. There has to be a compromise in that. I would certainly give 100% support to the point of preserving the Antarctica, even to the extent of banning cruise ships from going there. That is the last wilderness of this globe, and I would much rather see it being completely preserved in any way that we can.
Thank you, David. Peter.
Simon, the Green Party manifesto contains a total commitment to completing that network of marine conservation areas. As you said yourself, the protection of the wider marine environment and of fishing, it serves both. We have this big problem of overfishing, and we must restore our stocks through long-term regional management plans, of which marine conservation areas would form an important part. The problem's been, of course, that the EU fisheries policy, at least until recently, has given far too big a share of the fishing quota to the large industrial fishing boats, and the government has this opportunity now, which was one of the reasons why Greenpeace were launching their important campaign recently, to give the small, sustainable, inshore fishermen a fair quota of the fishing stock.
Thank you. I was all ready to come back with a nice cynical comment, but actually I'm very impressed with the level of knowledge about the marine from almost all of you, and I thank you for that. I hope that whichever one or several of you goes back into government after the election will take with you this as a great example of where you can invest in the environment, and it's the environment that will deliver you your growth and your development goals. And I'm not frightened of saying growth goals, because if you put money into, for example, in this case, protected areas, you end up with massively increased harvests, massively improved environment that is good for everybody. Whereas if you invest in fisheries subsidies, then you end up taking more out of the environment and depleting that environment. And whilst it is counterproductive to think that you may cut off an area, you will actually improve the environment for those that work in it. It is, I know it's counterintuitive. There are many examples in environment, looking at natural capital, of where we can actually invest in the environment. So don't forget when you go back into government, it's not all about infrastructure. Invest in environment and invest in that capital that will give you the growth that you're looking for.
Thank you, Simon. Any comments from the audience? There are two. Yes, there's one just up there. Thank you.
It's encouraging, obviously, to see the panel
largely agreeing on the support for marine conservation zones. And it's also encouraging, of course, that we have got 28, but remind everyone that the target was 127. And what worries me is the relatively slow progress that is being made towards this initial target. I think if many of us could see the often devastation that's created under the water, we would be appalled. And very often it's the equivalent of ancient woodlands underwater and destroyed, and the damage can be often irreparable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Julie Avril West from Dorset Pro Wind Group. Welcome, Julie.
In the agreed Bournemouth, Dorset and Poole renewable energy strategy, the county set an aspirational target of 7.5% renewable energy for 2020. So far, we've barely reached halfway, with only the length of the next Parliament to go. With applications for wind and solar being turned down or called in across the county, there appears to be little hope of achieving this target. What will you do, your party do, to ensure that Dorset contributes its fair share to the legally binding national target of 15% of total energy from renewables for 2020?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Julie. So in the agreed Bournemouth, Dorset and Poole renewable energy strategy, the county set an aspirational target of 7.5% renewable energy for 2020. So far, we've barely reached halfway, with only the length of the next Parliament to go. With applications for wind and solar being turned down or called in across the county, there appears to be little hope of achieving this target. What will you do to ensure that Dorset contributes its share to the legally binding national agreement of 15% renewables for 2020? Oliver.
Well, you're much more optimistic than you are. I think that the growth of photovoltaic power is now in Dorset very considerable. You do occasionally hit in suitable planning obstacles, so we were just talking about one where you have a conflict between two environmental goals of having increased renewable energy and preserving a triple SI, and in those cases it's right it should be called in, and in my view right it should be prevented. But otherwise, I'm in favour of the spread of solar energy. I think we have a huge opportunity in anaerobic digestion, and actually I think the offshore wind proposals for Dorset are also encouraging. So I think we can get there quite happily by the time of the end of the Parliament.
Thank you, Oliver. Ross.
One of the things that as a district councillor most concerned me, and which I fought very hard to overturn, was a decision by West Dorset District Council that we didn't need to have a 15% target, because they were doing it in Bournemouth and Poole and they were doing it in East Dorset, and actually we could coast in on the level of renewable energy that they had that they'd achieved. And I think it's absolutely appalling that in the local plan there isn't a higher push for renewables. I mean, nationally, my party's got a target of 60% energy generation from renewables by 2030, and we want to push for community energy strategies with investment through community energy co-ops, as well as really expanding investment from the Green Investment Bank and research and development in low carbon technologies. But I think we do have to address the issue in West Dorset, where people think that protecting parts of the environment is a reason to deny renewable energy.
Thank you, Ross. David.
We are in favour of 24/7 renewable energy, and I have a belief that if all the money that has gone into the production of wind farm subsidies had been put into tidal and wave energy research, by now we would have the most renewable energy in Europe, if not the world. We are an island nation. We are surrounded by water. Let's make proper use of it. So just what produces our electricity when there is no wind or too much wind? We are on an island, and it is alarming that successive governments have succumbed to large corporate businesses who support the construction of ugly turbines that despoil our beautiful countryside, create more CO2 in their construction, than they will ever save in their lifetime, and very dangerously use rare earth minerals. I believe that every new home and factory being built in West Dorset should be aligned to fit and carry solar panels.
Thank you, David.
It's a sad state of affairs that Dorset lies so far behind nearly all the other authorities in the southwest in the generation of renewable energy. And yet, Dorset's been identified by renewable energy companies as having the greatest potential for solar energy in the UK. And the UK has potential access to 40% of Europe's wind, quite a bit of it blowing through Dorset much of the time. Huge and important opportunities are being missed, therefore. The Green Party would require local authorities to have ambitious targets for the generation of renewable energy in their development plans, with major emphasis on support and development for community-owned or cooperatively owned renewable energy. We need to break up the oligopoly of the big six suppliers that has caused such distress for poorer members of our society. All schools and public buildings in Dorset should have solar PV installations. Along with this, we'd established Dorset's contribution to a huge programme of...
The Labour Party's got a target date of 2030 to take carbon out of its electricity supply. I've got very little truck with David's unsightly objection, I'm afraid. I grew up very close to a big power station, and that's not very beautiful, but it didn't stop people relying on the electricity that it provided. At the end of the day, we need to break our reliance on fossil fuels for our own good and that of the planet. They're a finite resource, they're getting increasingly scarcer and more expensive. We won't be able to afford to buy them. They tie us to countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia, and the raw materials are frankly too important to be burned. Oil's far more useful making medical instruments than it is being stuck in your domestic heating. So in general, I always support local renewable energy products, except for when they're slated for top-grade agricultural land. And to be honest, my biggest objection is that we're still using taxpayers' money to bribe already wealthy large landowners to put wind and solar farms on their land instead of using it to drive development.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll probably agree with a little bit of each of you, actually. But what I was going to say is that actually this 15% target for 2020 is actually the beginning. Targets are important. They're important in education, NHS, targets that are created in businesses. And the reason is they give you a place that you're going to go to. It gives you a time frame of when you're going to achieve it. And it gives you a way to measure progress. With something as crucial as climate change, which is addressed by renewables as one of the main ways to address it, and by reducing greenhouse gases. Not just the 2020 target, but targets after that, and after that, and after that are going to be part of what we're going to need. So I think the parties that have thought about targets for the future beyond 2020 are really thinking ahead.
Thank you, Jeannie.
Thank you.
People who, anybody else who hasn't yet, yes, just the gentleman here, just at the front, most recorded.
Good evening. Just want to pick up a couple of things that David mentioned. One, a power wind turbine recoups its outlay within 6 months, and then it's carbon free for 24.5 years. And the other thing is that Germany, Portugal, Spain, Denmark, they're heavily, and Scotland, heavily invested in wind turbines. I think they've got the right idea.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
I'm just suggesting a compromise that instead of having the wind power generated from something great mass, that every telegraph pole and every domestic chimney where the TV area used to be should have a small fan. They're all connected to the national grid anyway, which saves a lot of infrastructure and mass and line laying. So be done cheaply, economically, and without damage to the visual environment.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next next question is on badger cull and vaccination. That's from Sue Aldous from the Dorset Badger Vaccination Project. Welcome to Sue.
Thank you. Despite the best peer-reviewed science in the world, the last government pressed ahead with pilot badger culls that have thus far cost £9.8 million at £5,200 per badger, of which £3.5 million were policing costs. Is it right, when the police are having to make serious cuts, and when badger vaccination costs less than £100 per badger, to extend this failed policy to Dorset?
Thank you, Sue. And again, I'll just give this to the back. Despite the best peer-reviewed science in the world, the last government pressed ahead with pilot badger culls that have thus far cost £9.8 million at £5,200 per badger, of which £3.5 million were policing costs. Is it right, when the police are having to make serious cuts and when badger vaccination costs less than £100 per badger, to extend this failed policy to Dorset? And Ros, you're first.
No. The scientific evidence on the group that was set up and chaired by Lord Krebs to actually look at infection control actually suggested that the way in which the cull has been run is actually increasing TB. It certainly only seems in the two pilot areas so far to have reduced by a couple of percent. So the Liberal Democrats believe that we need a scientific-based policy. We want to see the increase in vaccination, and we actually want government to invest properly in rolling out a badger vaccination and also exploring a cattle vaccination that is adequate, because at the moment the vaccination isn't able, they're not able to test the difference between a vaccinated cow and an actually infected cow, and there needs to be proper research in that. However, farmers are very concerned, and I think wildlife...
Thank you, Ross. David.
Yes, I'm going to preempt the other two. Vaccination of cattle is potentially a way forward, but we must make sure that if cattle can be vaccinated against TB, we must make absolutely certain that the meat and the milk from cattle is still going to be edible. There is perhaps a hint that it isn't. So that has to be an absolute guarantee. But coming back to the policing, I'm going to say something incredibly unpopular to some of you. The policing bill is perhaps in direct relation to the perceived threat to the people carrying out those culls. And those culls were authorised by government, and yet people wearing masks, hiding their identity, did not want to be identified as trying to interfere with the culls. I think that is a highly dangerous activity. We must also wake up to the fact that in the past 20 or so years, the badger population has quadrupled.
Thank you, David. Peter.
The Green Party has been opposed to the badger cull from the very beginning. But it's more than an issue of cost, it's an issue of ethics, and it's an issue of the importance of hard scientific evidence coming into play, importantly. Evidence from Wales, where they've not culled badgers but focused on strict cattle control measures, shows a significant reduction in bovine TB. And I recently had a chance to look at a report from the University of London, which said of the available bovine TB control strategies, we believe that how frequently cattle are tested and whether or not farms utilise winter housing have the most significant effect on the number of infected cattle. Now that's in line with DEFRA's own chief vet, who recently said the fall in TB outbreaks in cattle herds cannot be attributed either to the pilot culls or in Wales to their badger vaccination programme. It's to do with the cattle control measures.
Thank you, Peter.
The Labour Party is wholly opposed to the badger culls, which have been an expensive and non-scientific failure. However, at the invitation of the local farmer, I think all the candidates visited a West Dorset farm, and we've seen the problems that have been caused by the explosion of the badger population. And in my opinion, the NFU, who should be there, have handled this matter really poorly. They would have done better for themselves to have focused less on farmers' problems and more on the problems that a flourishing badger population creates for other wildlife like hedgehogs. I think at the end of the day what we need to do now is we need to be working with farmers and scientists and wildlife groups to develop an alternative strategy to get bovine TB under control, and that includes prioritising vaccination.
Well, I disagree with the other panellists about this. I don't see this as either or, but both and. Certainly we need the cattle control measures, and we continuously revise those and enforce them. Certainly we need to invest more and carry forward efforts at vaccination. I think actually cattle vaccination is pretty much a red herring here. A badger vaccination may well prove productive in the long run. But in the meanwhile, we certainly also need to support the culling trials and carry them through and make a success of them, because the fact is that our farmers in West Dorset are currently being pulverised by bovine TB. That isn't fair on them, it isn't fair on taxpayers, the length and breadth of this country. We have to do something about it.
Thank you all.
Thank you for the response. I think that the general population would prefer that the amount of money spent would be better given to the police for policing the communities, especially given the fact that according to the last official DEFRA graph, the amount of cattle destroyed because of BTB represented only 4% of the total deaths for other reasons per year, and that's excluding the meat trade. So 4% is a tiny amount of cattle that are destroyed because of TB.
Thank you very much, Sue. And we'll take a comment from the front over here.
That's the second time that David has cleverly managed to deflect his answer so as not to give a direct answer to the question. So I'm still not quite sure whether he's saying UKIP is in favour of continuing the cull. He did this earlier with the Countryside Act, where he deflected onto policing, so we didn't get a direct answer as to whether they want to repeal the Countryside Act. This has then a bearing on Oliver's answer, because one gets the feeling that in these issues, the Tory party policy is being dictated by a fear of defectors from Tory voters to UKIP voters.
Okay, we'll take this for the chance.
Trevor Clegg, I'm the chairman of Dorset NFU, and Rachel, I did put in a question and I would have been down there if it had been chosen.
Oh, sorry.
Two of you are being very consistent. Two of you should be ashamed of yourselves, because at a recent NFU hustings you supported culling of badgers, and now you're saying you don't. And I think that is despicable. You should either be one way or the other. To say that the current pilot culls have been unsuccessful flies in the face of the evidence, especially from the Somerset cull, where 34% of the herds within that area were shut down with TB at the start of the cull. That figure is now 11%. Now, I think no one can argue against the fact that that is significant. We've heard about the experience in Wales and the drop in TB cases there. There's a simple reason for that. 4 years ago, the Welsh Government decided to try to get ahead of this disease and tested every single animal in the country within a 12-month period. If you increase the level of testing, of course you'll find more cases. And subsequently, because those cases were taken out, those animals were taken out, the incidence has dropped, but only dropped back to its previous level. It hasn't been controlled. Badger vaccination in Wales has only covered such a tiny portion of the country, less than 0.01%, so that can have had no effect at all. And so I, as a farmer, do not want to cull badgers. I have much better things to spend my time on. However, I feel there is a need to reduce the population, not to wipe it out,
I love to see all wildlife, but the badger population has got out of control, and it is, as Rachel rightly said, having a major effect on other species. And we, as managers of the countryside, have a responsibility to keep certain species under control when they get out of control. There is no one else who's going to do it. There's no natural predator for badgers. And as I often say, every species needs a predator, and there is one species above all which demonstrates that, which is us, and none of us are volunteering. But we do need to control the population, not eliminate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Maisie, we come to our final question, and it's a yes-no answer to this. We'll start with the MP to this time round. And this says, given recent research showing the damaging effects of neonicotinoids on bees and other pollinators, do you support a ban on their use?
Yes.
Thank you, Peter. David?
One word, no.
One word, no. Ros?
Yes.
Oliver?
I'm waiting for the evidence from the scientific review which is currently being conducted. But I'm certainly not going to give you a yes/no answer any more than I would if you asked me whether I'd stop beating my wife.
That's the next question, right?
I agree with Oliver apart from the last bit.
For the avoidance of doubt, I do not beat my wife.
Can I just, we're going to give each of our candidates 1 minute to sum up, so let's give them a few seconds maybe just to get their...
Take back your comment about domestic violence.
Yeah.
To get their thoughts together. And what we'll do is just, can I just say first of all, thank you very much for the audience in terms of coming here this evening and asking such good questions and the comments and so on. So thank you ever so much for your contribution, your participation in this. Can I also maybe counter the national sport of knocking politicians and say thank you personally from me to our 5 candidates for coming along and speaking to us this evening. Thank you very much. At the end, we've got someone who is going to give a full vote tonight, so I won't say any more. And if we do our 1 minute summary, Peter, are you happy to begin?
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
Whenever we in the Green Party say in public that we would not renew Britain's Trident nuclear missile programme, there are those who say that would jeopardise national security. Not only do I disagree with this opinion, but I find it astonishing that it's usually the very same people who are either denying or treating as a marginal issue the existence of climate change caused by human activity, the one genuine and overwhelming threat to our collective security. I urge you to vote Green on the 7th of May for the one party that is genuinely committed to tackling this threat to life on our planet. The only party with the policies to achieve a truly fair and sustainable society. Thank you.
Many thanks.
UKIP are going to abolish HS2 and save the £50 billion in that process. And in the process of its construction, if it goes ahead, if it were to go ahead, we would be losing something in the order of 14 Woodland Trust woods in the route. And some of those have the oldest trees in this country. UKIP also propose a ban on the sale of certain invasive plant species and the use of Rhododendron ponticum as a rootstock. We propose to eradicate the most destructive of our invasive alien species that pose the greatest threat to our indigenous biodiversity: the grey squirrels and the North American mink, the Japanese knotweed and Rhodoponticum, the floating pennywort and water primrose, and the North American signal crayfish. We want British wildlife to return to being British. For the very invaded by foreign species. I actually do detest people laughing at the non-conformity of the island.
Thank you, David. Ross.
Thank you. I'm standing for election here because I believe in justice and fairness, in promoting skills and the rural economy, protecting the NHS and access to our services, and supporting communities, giving them more power at a local level and in working with whoever it takes to get the job done. It's an MP's job to represent everybody, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're rural or urban. My party believes that each generation is responsible for the fate of our planet, and that by safeguarding the balance of nature and the environment and for the long-term continuity of life in all of its forms. When I joined the Liberal Democrats, I joined them from the Ecology Party, which I joined in the 1980s. I joined the Liberal Democrats because I actually wanted to achieve something. I wanted to be able to achieve something by being elected, successfully elected. And if you elect me, you will be electing somebody who has a 30-year record of green action, and you will be voting for someone who has a chance of winning here.
Thank you.
I want to end by saying something which derives very much from what we heard from the Wildlife Trust. I believe that there is a great mistake that many of those in the Green Movement have made, and that is to think that there is a war between economic development and aesthetic considerations on the one side, and keeping the planet safe and promoting biodiversity and natural capital on the other. I don't think there is such a war, and I don't think we should create one artificially. I think we can actually have both together. We can build natural capital and build it in a way that preserves our planet and at the same time enhances our economy and gives people a better chance of a better life. And that is the policy of my party.
Thank you.
We've had a really broad range of questions here tonight, but I wouldn't be doing my party justice if I didn't mention some of the other things that we're talking about, some of which have been alluded to this evening. We've been talking about protecting our forests and improving access to green spaces, as Leslie mentioned earlier on. We've got a plan to prioritise flood prevention and introduce work that will help us prepare for the effect of the changing climate, which I think the gentleman in the blue shirt mentioned earlier. Are we looking at tackling air pollution, working across departments to improve food security, which is obviously something that should be key to all of our aims, and also protecting animal welfare, not just by ending the badger cull and maintaining the hunting ban, but also by tackling the wildlife crime that's associated with shooting, which sometimes doesn't seem to get quite such a high priority. So I think that you need to look very carefully at all the different parties and the policies they have, not just in terms of the green agenda, but also in terms of their overall impact.
Thank you, Rachel. On behalf of the Alliance of the Dorset Environmental and Wildlife Groups, I'd just like to welcome Ian Mortimer to give the vote of thanks. Thank you, Ian.
On behalf of the groups who helped to organise tonight, we'd like to say thank you very quickly. First of all, Headmaster Mike Foley, who wasn't running fast enough when we needed a chairman. Also several other staff who were working behind the scenes who you haven't heard of, but thank you to them. A big thank you also to the students who've been here tonight. I must think all these old folks are really mad. And a very big thank you to the candidates who are most definitely mad. If they want to represent us, I guess they have to do this. And finally, a thank you to all of you for coming as well, and hopefully for all the wonderful donations you're going to make on behalf of the school environmental projects and on behalf of vaccinating badgers to help farmers. Thank you.
Yeah.